Good morning or afternoon or evening whenever you're watching this. Hope you're having a really good and blessed week. And this weekend we continue to think about this question that we've been exploring over the last month is, what does it mean to be church? What should characterize us as the people of God together? And to help us with that this week, we're going to be looking at what Paul wrote to the church in Philippi in Philippians 2, verse 12 to 18, particularly verses 12 to 16. But we're doing something slightly different this weekend, and I'm very interested to see how it works. I just wanted to let you know what we're doing. As we've been doing for a few months now, this talk is being made available on Friday as part of the online service that we publish. And we know that people access that at a time that works for them on their own or with families, and engage with it, and engage with the songs and the readings and the prayers and the talks, and think about the questions and see what God is saying to them through it. And then when we come together on a Sunday, we tend to discuss the questions in breakout groups. But we're not doing that on Sunday. We're not splitting into groups, we're staying together. And on Sunday, there's going to be a second talk on this passage, looking at a slightly later part of the passage, when opportunities within that for interaction and for questions. So that's the plan, and we'll see how it goes. So this talk is focused on verse 12 and 13, and the one for Sunday is looking at verses 14 to 16. So with that, let's have a look at these verses. Paul starts chapter 2 by reminding the believers of the wonderful experience they've been brought into through Jesus and the work of the Spirit in them. He encourages them to live in a way that demonstrates this new reality in their lives. And he goes on in verses 5 to 11 to encourage them to think the same way as Jesus thought. Those thoughts that motivated him to action, that caused him to humble himself, to stoop down, to become a servant, eventually to offer himself as a sacrifice and to die. And now, in verses 12 to 13, he comes to some further implications of that, encouraging them in verse 12 to work out their salvation with fear and trembling. And then in verse 13 he goes on to say, well, it's actually God who's at work in them. So it is reasonable to ask what Paul is really saying. Is it us working it out? Is it God working it out? Or is it both in some way? And that's what we're looking at here, and some of its powerful implications. It's important to recognize that in verse 2, Paul is not telling the believers to work for their salvation. He's telling them to work out their salvation. One of the things that Paul makes clear throughout his writings is that our salvation, our being made right with God, is a free gift from God to us. It is something made possible by the death and resurrection of Jesus, as Paul has just been speaking about earlier in the chapter. Something we receive by faith. Something that happens as a consequence of God's Spirit working within us. We believe that God has offered it. We believe that God can do it. We gratefully receive it, and we become new people. But it does not end there. We are new people. We are changed people. And this needs to be demonstrated in our lives. We need to act and behave differently. And that's what Paul is getting at here. By way of example, I'm currently an executor, one of the executors for my late mother's estate. It's something she asked me to do. It's something that's written into her will. But I needed to accept it and then put it into action. It wasn't enough for a piece of paper to say that Graham was an executor, but Graham needed to act like one. It gives me certain rights, along with responsibilities. It enables me to do things I would not otherwise have been able to do. I can talk to banks, I can talk to lawyers, I can talk to other official organisations and say, because I'm an executor, I can do things. I'm living in a particular way. And it requires me to do certain things in order to carry out my mother's wishes. Being saved as a free gift from God has given us a new status, but it also brings with it new responsibilities, a different way of living. We should not be the same as we were before God made this transforming change in our lives. We should not be the same as we were a week ago, as God continues to work in us. We need to demonstrate this new reality in what we say, in how we act, even in how we think. The New Living Translation puts it like this: work hard to show the results of your salvation, obeying God with deep reverence and fear. It's about producing fruit in our lives that demonstrates what God has done, what Jesus has done, what the Spirit has done and continues to do within us. We are to do this with fear and trembling, or a deep sense of awe and reverence and respect as we come into the presence of God. As Tom Moore, Captain Sir Tom Moore, reflected on his experience of being knighted by the Queen a week ago, he spoke about being absolutely overawed and the privilege of receiving such a high award from Her Majesty. Do we have that same recognition? Which should be a much deeper recognition of grandeur and majesty and position as we come into God's presence. Paul wanted this for the believers at Philippi. He wanted them to recognize the person, the grandeur of God, and to recognize the privilege of receiving such an amazing award from him. We have the wonderful privilege of being daughters and sons of God. He welcomes us gladly into his presence, and this is wonderful. But some of the comments I see on social media, some of the things people say, concern me that some have lost that sense of the greatness of God, the need for reverence, for a sense of awe in his presence. And it seems like this might not be a new thing, that Paul has to speak into it. And so Paul is encouraging them to keep it in mind. Paul is writing to every believer in the church at Philippi, commanding each of them to be doing this. And the times we are living in, the restrictions we are living under, do not change this call. Each of us who's entered into a saving relationship with Jesus are called to live as followers of Jesus, to live as those who are trying to bring honour to him, as those who want our lives to be fruitful in things that are important to him. Doing this does not change our status as sons and daughters of God, but our status should change how we live. How much of what we did and said and even thought during the last week was different from those around us because we know Jesus? How much of what we said and did was with the desire to lift Jesus high, to point others to him? How much of what we said and did was an understanding of what God wanted in that situation and being motivated by that desire? It's something for each of us to do, and for each of us to encourage the other in doing. But it is not something we need to do on our own, in our own strength. In Philippians 1:6, Paul reminds us that it was God who started this change in our lives. And here, in 2:13, he makes it clear that God is continuing to work in us. And because of that, we can have confidence to work it out in our lives. This is a theme that keeps on popping up in Paul's writings. He talks about what a wonderful thing that God has done in us, and that encourages us to live out the reality and implications of it. in the strength that God provides. It is really important to see what Paul is saying God is working towards in our lives. Here the focus is not on blessing us, on us experiencing the deep joy that comes from being in a relationship with God, though these are wonderful and should be celebrated and enjoyed and experienced. But what Paul is saying here is that the reason God is working in us so that we become more closely aligned with him, both in what we think and in what we do. That the things we want to do becomes the things that God wants. That our actions, motivated by those desires, are targeted on achieving God's purposes. God's purposes in our lives, in our church, in our community, and in the wider world. Paul does not give here a prescriptive list of what that might mean. There is a need for each of us to spend time with God, to listen to God, to hear what is on God's heart, and to align ourselves with those thoughts, with those desires, in what we think and in what we do. So this is something of what Paul is getting at here. We are new people because of the work of Jesus and the Spirit in our lives. God is still at work in us, making us more like his Son. The Spirit is still seeking to grow fruit in our lives and to give us the gifts we need to support each other and to do the things that God is calling us to do. And we are called to recognize the reality of this, to work with God so that his plans and purposes are carried out in our lives and through our lives for the blessing of others. And as church family together, we are called to encourage and support each other in this. And I don't know exactly what this might look like to you, and you might not either. So here are some questions to think about, to reflect on, and to pray into. What are you doing to work out your salvation? Do you approach God with the reverence and respect he deserves? How much do you see your life aligned with fulfilling God's purposes? As you reflect on those questions, ask the Spirit to give you the ability to change those things that are not giving God the place he deserves in your life. So there's the challenge, to work out the reality of who we are in our daily lives, to align ourselves with God, to be part of what God is doing. And on Sunday we'll come back and look at the next few verses to see something else that, following on from this, Paul calls us to do. May God bless us as we reflect on his word, as we allow his Spirit to change us and transform us to be more like Jesus.